She was just a child no more than 10 years old when the Pontifex Maximus pointed her out from the crowd and declared her the next Vestal Virgin. From that moment on, her life was no longer her own, chosen not for power, wealth, or ambition, but for purity and destiny. She assumed a role that would bind her to Rome more intimately than any emperor or senator ever could. But here's the question that haunts history. What compelled Romans to consign their daughters to a life of sacred imprisonment? The selection of a Vestal Virgin known as Virgo Vestalis was a solemn and chilling ceremony that would forever alter a young girl's destiny. The requirements were exacting and unforgiving. The candidate had to be between 6 and 10 years old, with both parents alive, a Roman citizen, and free from any hint of dishonor. Furthermore, she had to be physically flawless and born of a legally valid marriage, a symbolic mirror of Rome's ideal purity. Picture this: a group of terrified little girls, standing before Rome's most powerful priest. The girl was placed among them, and from this group, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's high priest, selected her by lot or direct appointment. And here's what the history books often gloss over: being chosen was not a universally welcomed honor. Many families wept, not from pride, but from fear. They understood what awaited their daughter. Once chosen, the girl was led away in silence. She crossed the Sacra Via, the sacred road, for the last time as a daughter of Rome. From that moment on, she belonged to the goddess Vesta, and her body and soul became the property of the state. The biographer Plutarch, in his Life of Numa, describes how King Numa Pompilius established the Vestal Virgins, entrusting them with the sacred fire and selecting them from noble Roman families. This was not just a religious duty, it was an act of state, laden with ritual, reverence, and the weight of Rome's moral expectations. The Vestals were installed in the house of the Vestals, the atrium Vesti, next to the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. There, under the strict supervision of senior Vestals and priests, she would spend the next 30 years in service. 30 years. Let that sink in. 10 years learning her duties, 10 years performing them, and 10 years teaching the next generation. Her roles were not just religious, they were political. The flame she was to guard symbolized the eternal life of Rome itself, and her chastity was seen as a direct reflection of the moral integrity of the state. These girls were bound not by chains, but by laws more ironclad than any prison wall. And once chosen, there was no returning. Not to their home, not to their name, and, most painfully, not to the life they once knew. To serve Vesta was to be transformed into an icon, a symbol of Rome's virtue. But beneath the surface of reverence lay a darker truth. The city would worship her, until she made a single mistake. But perhaps the most binding rule of all was the one that governed her body. The vow of chastity, made before the goddess Vesta herself, was irrevocable. For 30 years, a Vestal Virgin was forbidden to marry, touch, or be touched by any man. This wasn't simply a religious doctrine, it was a matter of state security. Her body was sacrosanct, and the purity it represented wasn't just personal. It was political. Think about that for a moment. A child, barely old enough to understand what love or intimacy meant, was forced to renounce it forever before she'd even experienced it. She was sacred, but never safe. The Vestal Virgin, dressed in ceremonial white and honored by the people of Rome, lived not only under divine obligation, but under the ever-present weight of Roman law, relentless and absolute. Venerated in public, but policed in private, her sanctity was protected by methods more brutal than divine. So what happened when even Rome's most venerated women slipped up? The Vestals were bound by 3 fundamental laws: perpetual virginity, unwavering obedience, and strict guardianship of the sacred fire. Violate any of these, and the consequences were swift and often merciless. If the eternal flame of the Temple of Vesta went out, it wasn't considered merely a ritual failing, it was a dire omen for the Roman state. In such cases, the acting chief Vestal could face private punishment, sometimes flogging, administered by the Pontifex Maximus, but always away from public view. This was not a symbolic punishment. It was a brutal and humiliating ritual, carried out in complete darkness, often at night, to protect the sacred woman from public view even while she suffered. Ancient sources confirm that when the sacred fire was extinguished, the vestals were sometimes beaten with rods, always in the dark, and never publicly stripped, a stark reminder of the cold balance between ritual dignity and physical violence. Beyond physical punishment, psychological isolation was constant and calculated. For the full 30 years of her service, a vestal was required to remain celibate, her life strictly confined within the atrium vesti, a secluded complex in the Roman Forum. Her interactions were closely monitored. She couldn't even speak freely to men. The slightest rumor of misconduct could trigger a full investigation by the College of Pontiffs, and once accused, a vestal had almost no defense. Roman justice, in these cases, rarely presumed innocence. Think about living under that kind of scrutiny, every conversation analyzed, every glance interpreted, every moment watched. Being a vestal didn't mean freedom from pain or fear. It meant living in a sanctified cage, venerated at altars, and beaten into silence. These women existed in a paradox, simultaneously the most honored and the most vulnerable people in Rome. They were given privileges that other women could only dream of. The right to own property, to make a will, to sit in reserved seats at public games. But all of this came at an impossible price: the complete surrender of their bodies, their choices, and their futures. The Roman Republic prided itself on its law, virtue, and discipline. But when the symbol of that virtue, a vestal virgin, was believed to have broken her vow of chastity, Rome's justice became silent, solemn, and utterly ruthless. It was a punishment so horrendous in its calm ritualism that no blood was shed, and yet a life was extinguished all the same. What crime, in Rome, demanded burial alive? The crime was incestum, a sacred violation, the desecration of Vesta's purity. If a vestal virgin was found guilty of breaking her vow of chastity, the punishment was not torture, nor execution by sword, but a ritual burial alive. This method, designed to avoid the shedding of sacred blood, was a bloodless execution, reserved only for the most venerated women in Rome. Let me walk you through one of the most documented cases. The execution of vestal virgins in 216 BC remains one of the most detailed and tragic examples of Roman justice. According to the historian Livy, 2 vestal virgins, Opimia and Floronia, were condemned by the Pontifical College on the charge of incestum for violating their sacred vows. Their trial was not public, and any defense they might have presented has not survived history. Once found guilty, their fates were sealed. One was buried alive. The other took her own life to avoid the horror that awaited her. Now, here's where the ritual becomes truly disturbing. The execution began in silence. No screams, no protests. The condemned vestal virgin was led through the Roman Forum in a solemn procession, draped in white, barefoot, and with her face covered like a bride being led to her wedding. But this was not a marriage. It was her funeral. The procession stopped at the Campus Celeratus, the field of the damned, just outside the Colline Gate. There, a chamber had already been prepared, dug deep into the earth. Inside was a bed, a lamp, bread, water, and milk, symbols of minimal life, just enough to pretend her death wasn't a state-sanctioned execution. The Romans insisted she wasn't executed, but given over to the gods. It was a legal fiction that allowed them to maintain their moral superiority while committing an act of unimaginable cruelty. Once she descended the steps into that underground tomb, the entrance was sealed with earth and stones. No one would ever hear her again. The state didn't recognize this as homicide. By providing sustenance, Rome could claim it was simply subterranean incarceration. But there was no escape, no ransom, no legal appeal. When the air ran out, so did her life, and with it, any doubt that Rome was capable of enshrining brutality in the name of virtue. The ritual never included a public spectacle of death. That was the purpose. Silence was as much a tool as the tomb itself, meant to erase the fallen vestal virgin from public memory. Her name, her reputation, her very existence were sealed beneath the earth, buried not just physically, but historically. The fate of Rome's vestal virgins reveals a civilization determined to sanctify innocence while punishing imperfection with ruthless precision. Revered as divine symbols, yet discarded when accused, these women stood at the crossroads of religion, law, and power, buried not just underground, but under the weight of empire. What does this tell us about Rome? About power? About the price of purity in a society obsessed with control? These women were simultaneously the most privileged and the most imprisoned people in Roman society. They could own property when other women couldn't. They could witness wills and make legal contracts. They had front row seats at the games. People stepped aside when they passed in the street. But all of these privileges were conditional, contingent on their continued perfection. One accusation, one rumor, one moment of human weakness, and everything could be taken away. Not just their status, but their lives. And here's the truly chilling part. We don't know how many of these women were actually guilty. The historical record is clear that accusations were sometimes politically motivated. Vestal virgins were buried alive during times of military defeat or political crisis. Scapegoats for Rome's failures, sacrificed to restore divine favor. Think about what that means. A child, taken from her family, forced into a life of service, punished brutally for minor infractions, and then potentially executed on false charges to appease a panicking populace. This wasn't justice. This was state-sanctioned ritual murder dressed up in religious ceremony. The system was designed to be unquestionable. The Vestals were too sacred to be defended effectively. How could a mortal man speak for a woman accused of betraying a goddess? The very nature of their position made them vulnerable to the worst kind of abuse, the kind that hides behind divine authority. In the shadow of such rituals, we must ask, what does a society lose when humanity is sacrificed in the name of purity? What does it say about us that we can venerate someone one day and bury them alive the next? The story of the Vestal Virgins is not just about ancient Rome. It's about what happens when ideology becomes more important than people, when symbols matter more than souls, when the appearance of virtue is valued above actual human welfare. These women weren't just casualties of a harsh legal system. They were victims of a society that demanded impossible perfection from those it claimed to honor most. They were children who never got to choose their own path, women who never experienced love, human beings reduced to living symbols whose only value was in their continued purity. As the ancient historian Thucydides observed, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The Vestal Virgins suffered under the weight of Rome's power, sacrificed on the altar of state religion and political expediency. So I ask you, what do we sacrifice today in the name of our ideals? What are we willing to bury, or whom are we willing to bury, to maintain the appearance of our own virtue? Comment below with your thoughts. And remember to like and subscribe for more forgotten stories from history that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about civilization itself.